Normally when people say, this is a really difficult video for me to make, it's because they're going to talk about breaking up with their girlfriend or something. This is a really difficult video for me to make for a completely banal reason. This is a really difficult video for me to make because I do not want to read out any of the quotations from vegan extremists that I basically need to employ to make this video.
À-bas-le-ciel.
And reason number 2 why I generally don't care for vegan behavior is that you're often aggressive and hostile. And it's not often that I agree with something the Young Turks say, but they did do a segment on veganism which I think sums up my views toward the issue pretty nicely.
PETA can be extremist in some ways. PETA can be extremist in some ways.
Yeah.
PETA can be extremist in some ways, and I think that some vegans are extremists in some ways. They see this as a moral issue.
No, but that's what I was
going to
get to.
They get crazy about it.
That's right, standing in the lobby with tech. Reefer sheets make the leak taste.
I do not want to read out any of the quotations from vegan extremists that I basically need to employ to make this video. Okay? We have a real problem here on YouTube. If you say something, other YouTubers will quote it out of context, right? They'll take that snippet and then make it seem as if your opinion is the exact opposite of what your opinion is. Like I'm quoting someone else to show how wrong they are. Now that actually is criminal under American law. We have really, really clear high court precedents on that in the United States. To misrepresent someone, to make them seem as if they're damned out of their own mouth in that way is especially harshly punished in the United States. May or may not be illegal where you are, but whatever. This is a hard video for me to make, not for emotional reasons. The title of this video is not clickbait. There is really a sense in which roaming millennial makes a valid point, but just utterly fails to provide valid examples when she's talking about vegan extremism. What is vegan extremism? Is it a problem? Yes. And I think I am the only vegan YouTube channel I know that has really consistently raised the alarm about that. The whole history of my channel, I've always been talking about that from day one on this YouTube channel, okay? The only example in Roaming Millennial's video, the only example given of extremism is in a quote from the Young Turks. That's another YouTube channel. There's a quote suggesting that PETA, people with ethical treatment knows that PETA is extremist. Look, people, the problem within veganism, the problem of extremism, it ain't PETA. They put out an annual report which is submitted to the U.S. government. It breaks down for you their budget, their activities. They spend millions and millions of dollars every year. Huge, huge budget. Nothing in that budget is extremist. You know, I mean, some of it is hard to take seriously that way. Some of it is real old school ambulance chasing activism, trying to create little controversies here and there and score points with their donors and get as much press coverage as they possibly can for standing up on the issue. Some of it's pretty silly. And a lot of it, of course, is money spent on advertising, which we all see. PETA, earlier this year, they filled one entire subway station in England where they bought all the advertising space, covered the whole subway station with advertising promoting veganism. Now, if that's extremist, if paying fair money for advertising space in a magazine or a subway station, if that's extremist, then what isn't? You know, this is ridiculous. So no, PETA does not represent extremism. Somebody who does is Professor Steve Best.
Me and Trife, yo, we wicked with letter, especially when both our tummies ain't fed. Dead or click, aiming for your head.
And her whole video would be exponentially stronger. Roaming Millennial's video would be stronger if, instead of complaining about what some vegans say, instead of complaining about what anonymous comments on Reddit say about veganism, if instead she'd taken the bull by the horns and dealt with just one example of a true extremist vegan. Now, you're going to notice Professor Steve Best, if you put him into Google or you follow the links I'm going to provide below this video, it seems like most of his action was from around the year 2009, and then he kind of thins out. There's a really dramatic story that's written up on 2 different blogs I'm going to give you links to about the fact that because he was so pro-violence, And he associated himself with other vegans who were willing to engage in threats of violence, sabotage, trespassing, illegal acts of various kinds, which he openly praises. You're going to see quotations from him openly praising illegal and violent activities. But, if you sleep with dogs, you stand up with fleas. And eventually, he was dealing with threats of violence from people who had been his colleagues directed against himself. At some point, there was an internal power struggle. You can read the accounts. And he turned to the police for protection and tried to get a restraining order, tried to get protection against his fellow activists who had been his colleagues. Now, again, this video would be better if I could read out for you a bunch of quotations about what Steve Best said. But this stuff is so incendiary, and I don't want to be quoted out of context. I don't want people to think it's me saying this, that I'm going to read you none of it. But if you click on the links below this video, you're going to see words like bloodshed. You're going to see words like fear, revolution. You're going to see a lot of anti-capitalist rhetoric, along with the, frankly, terrorist rhetoric. And for many years, he was going around on the vegan lecture circuit and giving seemingly respectable, lectures. But if you go past the surface, what's beneath that veneer is not worthy of our respect. It's actually worthy of our condemnation. And again, I wish I could tell you we had a lively intellectual discourse going on here within veganism where other people would criticize that and would be discussed and well understood. But no, I don't know any channel other than my own that ever tackled Steve Best this way. And I received a lot of criticism. Many vegans would agree with Steve Best's position that, for example, a university professor who engages in vivisection in order to do cancer research or Parkinson's research into human diseases, they are exploiting and torturing animals. Steve Best believes that the use of violence, threats, intimidation, and terrorism against a person like that is morally justified. That's his position. And given that he's a professor on a university campus and he was mostly doing campus activism and trying to radicalize students, you can see pretty quickly what direction that's going to take. And you can imagine pretty easily what a dim view the FBI would have of that kind of activity, right? So it's not even the case that you can say this is something that goes down a slippery slope or spirals out of control. From step one, it's out of control. It's bad in principle and in practice. It's already evil when you're at the top of the slope. And those are issues that are really worth talking about. It's unfortunate that someone like Roaming Millennial decided to tackle this without taking the slightest interest in selecting examples that would actually make her case worth discussing, worth reflecting on for meat eaters and for vegans alike. As a parallel from another walk of life, I've done a lot of historical research. Like Roaming Millennial, by the way, we're both political science majors. I have written many papers about the history of communism. And I am not a communist. I'm not a communist sympathizer. Quite the opposite. You could make a statement criticizing communism that seems utterly unreasonable and over the top if it's being applied to East Germany in the 1970s, but that would be quite reasonable or quite accurate if it was applied to Cambodia in the 1970s, right? And now, I'm not saying this because I'm a big fan of East German society, but the difference between the two is extreme, so much so that there were, in fact, refugees who escaped from communism in Cambodia, not to get to capitalist paradise, but to get to East Germany. And those guys will tell you themselves just how stark a difference it was. East Germany was a society controlled by, secret police, amazing levels of surveillance and state repression, but nevertheless, stark contrast to the extreme violence. Mass murder, etc., that was the daily reality in Cambodia in roughly the same period of time. Okay? So when constructing an argument and trying to make it reasonable and relatable and comprehensible to the audience, the selection of examples matters. Full stop. The type of extremism she complains about within veganism, does it exist? Yes. Is there an onus on us, if you're going to be an intellectual and an opinion maker, or possibly a leader and organizer in veganism as a movement, is there an onus on us to really criticize itself thoroughly and to write the constitutions and manifestos for our own organizations in a way that excludes those things, in a way that very clearly defines where we stand, and that we're not on that slippery slope, we're not on that downward spiral, we don't sympathize that. Yes, there is an onus on us, there's an obligation on us to define where we stand and point out just how different we are from people like Stephen Best. We don't support that. We don't compromise with that. However, we can also say that even if there's a shred of something reasonable and relevant and important in Roaming Millennial's argument, she made herself seem ridiculous by just attributing these views to things that some vegans say. An incredibly weak basis for an argument. It'd be weak if you're just criticizing things that some feminists say without using a specific example or what have you. And even worse, she leans on anonymous comments that she just picked up out of a discussion forum, instead of doing the little bit of research and working from real life experiences, real examples that we can relate to.
Vegans, just imagine for a second if every ideology in the world behaved that way. If every ideology out there acted like the people who didn't agree with them were monsters.
My video could end there. I'll say one more thing. On YouTube, we have some advantages and some disadvantages compared to CNN, CBC, BBC, formal broadcast media. I think the greatest advantage we have is the ability to talk about personal experience. It's really troubling to me that at one point in her video, she turns to the audience and asks, vegans, ask yourself, how would you feel if we were living in a world where one ideology treated other ideologies, or treated the outsiders of that ideology, as if they're subhuman, as if they're just worthy of contempt? I don't know what world you live in, kid.
If every ideology out there acted like the people who didn't agree with them were monsters.
I don't know, how do Hindus regard Muslims? How do Muslims regard Buddhists? Do you have experience with those kinds of ideological divisions? Because in that context, I've got to tell you, her complaint is that vegans are somehow unconscionably, unforgivably cruel to non-vegans. Well, compared to what? Compared to any really deep divisions between ideologies, compared to the way that communists regard capitalists, or the way fascists regard socialists, I actually think even that little part of her argument is not sustainable, is not meaningful. It makes itself ridiculous and risible just because of her failure to use examples. And again, we have a lot of disadvantages over traditional media. But one of the advantages we have is nobody's going to cut us off and put in an advertisement for soap or, a beer commercial or what have you. We can sit down and talk about, hey, this is where I'm coming from. This is my experience of looking at, say, internecine hatred between Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim. And I'm really going to tell you that my experience with vegans and their attitudes towards meat eater is even worse. You could say that, but I doubt it. I've got experience in all those walks of life. I'm a former scholar of Buddhism, also a former political science major. I've done politics of Asia, politics of Buddhism. And let me tell you, the level of respect and real compassion that vegans feel for meat eaters, the level of meaningful engagement, of really being helpful that vegans have towards meat eaters in a circumstance where we regard you as doing something that causes suffering to animals, destroys the environment, and even destroys your own health. Actually, I think if you're going to put it in that comparative context, whether you compare it to ideologies like communism or religions like Buddhism and Islam, I think actually vegans deserve one whole hell of a lot more credit than you give them, Roaming Millennial.
À-bas-le-ciel.